The sun hung low over the distant horizon, a blood-red orb that painted the heavens with streaks of fiery orange and violet. The air was thick with the kind of humidity that made every breath feel like inhaling a damp towel. The alien world of Erythros was strange and inhospitable, but for now, it was home to the ragtag crew of the Maverick, a rusted-out exploration ship that had once been a proud vessel of the human galactic exploration fleet. Now, it was little more than a floating junkyard, held together by sheer will and an unhealthy amount of duct tape. At the helm sat Captain Sophie Caulfield, her fingers drumming an absent beat on the cracked control panel. She surveyed the screen in front of her, her eyes narrowing at the flashing red alert. "Well, this is just fantastic," she muttered under her breath, clearly annoyed, but not surprised. It had been one of those weeks. Her first officer, Lieutenant Jace Reynolds, hovered behind her, leaning over her shoulder. He, too, was no stranger to disaster. "What's the damage this time?" Jace asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge of sarcasm. Sophie shot him a sidelong glance. "It's the fuel injectors." Again. Honestly, they've been on the fritz since the last run to SETI 7, and now they're completely shot. We're running on fumes. If we don't get to a refueling station, we're stuck here. Jace crossed his arms, his gaze drifting toward the viewport. Through the glass, Erythros looked like an inhospitable swamp, a planet dominated by thick jungles, with rivers that cut through the land like deep scars. The locals, a primitive species called the Zeral, were rumored to be hostile, but they had yet to show their faces, leaving the crew to deal with mechanical failure alone. "So, what's the plan? Send out an SOS, wait for help?" Jace asked. Sophie's lips twitched into a wry smile. "Help? From whom? We're light years away from the nearest fleet, and even if we did get a response, there's no guarantee they'd arrive before we run out of air." Jace winced, the edge of humor evaporating from his tone. "Right. So, we're on our own, then." "Always have been," Sophie replied, turning back to the controls. "And if you've got any ideas on how to fix a fusion reactor with a busted wrench and a spare coil, I'm all ears." It wasn't that Sophie didn't appreciate Jace's practical mind. He was good at problem solving. He was quick on his feet when it came to diplomacy, and he could always find a way to make things work, most of the time. But today was different. Today, they were stranded in a place that was as far from civilization as any of them had ever been. "Hey, we're not dead yet, right?" Jace said, clapping her on the back. "You're the best damn captain I know. If anyone can get us out of this, it's you." Sophie didn't respond immediately. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, and while her heart wanted to be optimistic, her brain wasn't willing to be fooled. But the crew was depending on her. They always did, and despite the circumstances, Sophie couldn't let them down. "Right," she said finally, with a grim determination. "I'll get us out of this, one way or another." But as she spoke those words, the ship lurched violently, a deep mechanical groan echoing through the hull. "What the hell?" Jace shouted, grabbing the side of the control panel as the Maverick shook like a rag doll in the hands of a giant. The ship pitched wildly, and Sophie fought to regain control. "Brace yourselves," she shouted, her voice rising above the cacophony of alarms blaring through the cockpit. The ship's systems flickered, their failing power draining with each passing moment. Sparks flew from the side panels, and the engine rumbled like a beast in agony. Sophie's hands were a blur as she punched in commands, trying to stabilize the ship's descent. "Hold on. We're going down," she shouted again, though she wasn't sure if anyone on board could hear her over the roar of the failing engines. Jace was already moving, grabbing the emergency oxygen masks and tossing them to the crew members who hadn't yet grabbed onto their seats. The alarms blared louder, the ship's hull groaning as it plummeted toward the surface of Erythros. "Can we get a trajectory?" Jace asked, his voice sharp, even through the panic. Sophie's fingers danced across the terminal, a mix of desperation and concentration on her face as she tried to keep their path steady. The readout flashed, then froze. The ship was still on course to crash, the trajectory locked in. "We're not going to make it," Sophie said, her voice low but steady. "Not like this." But then, as if the universe had decided to throw them a bone, a warning flashed on her screen. The ground was approaching fast, but there was something else, something unusual. A red blip on the radar, a large structure of some kind rising from the thick foliage of the jungle below. "We've got something down there," Sophie said, her voice tinged with a note of hope. "Is it a city? A settlement?" Jace asked, his tone skeptical. There was no way they'd be that lucky. "Not sure," Sophie said, her fingers working furiously to adjust the ship's flight path. "But it's better than nothing." The ship jolted again, throwing everyone into the air for a moment before gravity reclaimed them. Sophie's eyes narrowed as the structure on the radar grew closer, a massive shape now visible through the viewport, a towering silhouette of what seemed to be metal and stone, rising above the tree line like a monument. There was no time to analyze it further. They were going down. "Brace for impact," Sophie shouted, gripping the controls with both hands as she steered the Maverick toward the strange structure. The ship lurched again, but this time, it was as if the ship responded to her urgency, the controls snapping back to life as if the ship was determined to make one last desperate attempt to save them. The world outside the viewport was a blur of green and brown as they neared the ground. For a moment, Sophie thought they were going to slam right into the dense jungle, but the structure loomed larger and larger in her sights, a flickering hope that they might land somewhere that offered a chance at survival. The impact came faster than expected, a jarring collision that threw the crew into a wave of pain and disorientation. Metal screamed, and the ship bucked beneath them, but then, all at once, the world seemed to stop. Silence. Sophie opened her eyes. The cockpit was filled with smoke, and the control panel flickered weakly, but the ship was still standing. Somehow, they had made it, crashing mere meters away from the massive structure. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, then turned to Jace, who was already moving toward the hatch. "Well," he said, half grinning despite the chaos, "I guess we're not dead yet." "Not yet," Sophie replied, forcing a smile despite the knot of uncertainty in her stomach. "But we're not out of the woods, either." As she stood, surveying the wreckage of the Maverick, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this planet, this strange, alien place, held more danger than they were prepared to handle. But it also held something else. Something that might be their ticket to survival. They just had to figure out what that something was. With a deep breath, Sophie nodded toward the open hatch. "Let's find out what's out there." As the smoke cleared from the wreckage of the Maverick, Sophie, Jace, and the rest of the crew emerged from the ship, stepping into the humid, oppressive atmosphere of Erythros. The air tasted thick, almost metallic, and the distant hum of the jungle created a constant, low buzz that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Sophie stood at the hatch, surveying the scene. The ship was a mess. The forward section had smashed into the ground hard, leaving the metal twisted and scorched, but they had survived, against all odds. Jace was the first to speak, pushing his way through the overgrown underbrush, his hand running along the side of the ship. "Well, we're not exactly in one piece, but it looks like we can at least walk away from this." Sophie's eyes narrowed, and she glanced back at the wreckage. "For now. But we need to figure out our next move. That structure, we need to get to it. It might hold answers. It's our only shot at finding supplies or," she paused, her gaze fixing on the distant silhouette. The structure loomed like a monolith, standing tall above the jungle. The deeper they ventured into the dense foliage, the more it seemed like a mirage. It shouldn't be there, not on a planet like this, where nothing had seemed even remotely civilized. The trees, twisted and alien, stretched their limbs as if trying to block their path. "I still don't like this," Jace muttered, adjusting the laser rifle slung over his shoulder. "It's too quiet. This place doesn't feel right." Sophie, always the optimist, gave him a reassuring grin, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You can't always trust your gut. This might be the break we need. Stay focused." The rest of the crew followed behind them, their faces grim as they trekked through the jungle. With every step, the air grew thicker, the jungle denser. The Zeril, if they were around, hadn't made themselves known yet. But the absence of sound, the unnatural silence that hung over the land, did little to ease the sense of unease that crept through the group. It was as if the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. As they neared the structure, the jungle thinned out, and Sophie could make out the edges of something metallic, something ancient, rising from the underbrush. The structure was not the product of nature. It had been built, long ago, perhaps, and yet, it had an eerie, almost organic quality to it. "Is that a door?" Jace asked, pointing toward the center of the structure. Sure enough, there was a massive, arching opening at the base, an entrance that beckoned them like an invitation they couldn't refuse. Sophie exchanged a glance with Jace. There was no turning back now. "Well, we're here," she said, leading the way. "Let's see what's inside." The air inside the structure was cool compared to the stifling heat of the jungle, and it smelled faintly of ozone, as if the building itself still had some pulse running through its veins. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, alien symbols that none of them recognized. The lighting, or what seemed like lighting, was dim but bright enough to reveal the faint glow of luminescent markings on the walls. "Is this some kind of temple?" Lieutenant Maya Lu, the ship's biologist, asked, her voice tinged with awe. Sophie could only shake her head. "I don't know what it is. But whatever it is, it's ancient. This place hasn't seen activity in centuries." They ventured deeper into the structure, the walls closing in as the corridor narrowed. It was clear this wasn't just a simple ruin, it was something far more advanced, something that had been built for a purpose far beyond anything they could imagine. The silence was oppressive, every step echoing off the stone floors. A low hum vibrated beneath their feet, and Sophie paused, her brow furrowing. "Did anyone else feel that?" "I felt it," Jace said, scanning the surroundings with his rifle raised. "Something's wrong." Just then, the hum intensified, and with a sudden burst of energy, the entire room shifted. The floor beneath them began to move, tilting like the floor of a carnival ride, and Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The walls trembled, and the faint glow of the markings on the walls flickered, as if the building was coming to life. "Get back!" Sophie yelled, her instincts kicking in as she pulled Jace and the others away from the shifting floor. But it was too late. The room began to sink downward, and the ground beneath them collapsed entirely, sending them plummeting into darkness. The fall seemed to last an eternity, the world spinning out of control. Sophie could hear the shouts of her crew, but the sounds grew distant as they plunged deeper. The world finally stopped spinning, and Sophie's body slammed into something hard. Her breath was knocked out of her, and for a moment, everything went dark. She groaned and forced her eyes open, her vision blurry. When her eyes cleared, she saw nothing but shadows, shadowy shapes flickering in the dark. She pushed herself to her feet, her head spinning. The fall hadn't killed them, but it had certainly knocked the wind out of them. "Everyone okay?" she asked, her voice rasping from the impact. "I think so," Jace responded, his tone grim. He stood nearby, brushing off debris. "Anyone else feel like we're in the middle of a bad horror film?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. They were in a massive underground chamber, far larger than the space they had fallen from. The walls were smooth, dark, and reflective, giving the place a haunting, otherworldly feel. There was a faint, pulsing glow coming from a series of raised platforms scattered throughout the chamber. "Where are we?" Maya asked, her voice quiet but filled with awe. This place is alive, isn't it?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had been thinking the same thing. The air here felt different, charged with something unseen. It was like the room itself was breathing. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the shadows. Jace spun, raising his rifle. "Did anyone else hear that?" Before anyone could answer, the growl came again, louder this time, closer. And then, a shape emerged from the darkness. The creature that emerged from the shadows wasn't something they'd expected. It wasn't a large, monstrous predator, nor was it a hulking brute that one could easily identify. No, this creature was something far more unnerving. It was humanoid in shape, but its form was distorted, like a shadow brought to life, its body elongated and shifting as though it was struggling to hold any consistent form at all. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a blur of dark, shimmering features, a series of swirling tendrils that seemed to shift in the dim light. The creature's eyes, however, were unmistakable, glowing, otherworldly orbs that pierced the darkness, locking onto each of them with an almost calculating intensity. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The creature didn't move immediately, but its presence seemed to hang in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. The glow from its eyes was hypnotic, and for a brief moment, Sophie felt like she couldn't look away. "What in God's name is that?" Jace muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The creature tilted its head, its strange form swaying in a way that defied gravity. It was like watching smoke twist in the wind, shifting and reforming constantly. Its presence was disorienting, and Sophie could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "We need to get out of here," Maya said urgently, her voice trembling. She backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm, but Sophie quickly raised a hand to stop her. "Wait," Sophie whispered, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Let's not make any sudden moves." The creature continued to observe them, its glowing eyes narrowing as it studied them one by one. It was as if it was weighing their worth, measuring them for some unknown purpose. Sophie had faced her fair share of hostile species in her years of exploration, but this felt different. This wasn't just a predator sizing them up. It felt intelligent. Deliberate. She slowly, cautiously, stepped forward, trying to stay as calm as possible. "We're not your enemies," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We're just stranded. We didn't mean to intrude. We just need help." The creature's tendrils flickered in response to her words, but it didn't move. For a moment, the silence hung heavy in the air, and Sophie couldn't help but feel like they were being judged by something far beyond their understanding. Then, in a soft whisper that vibrated through the air, the creature spoke. "You are not like them." Its voice wasn't audible in the traditional sense. It was a strange, psychic transmission that resonated directly in their minds, an alien language that felt like it was pressing against their thoughts, slipping into their consciousness with a subtle weight. Sophie blinked in surprise, her mind racing. "What do you mean, not like them?" The creature's form shuddered, its eyes narrowing further. "The others. The ones who came before." Jace's hand hovered near his weapon, but Sophie shot him a warning look. They were dealing with something far beyond their comprehension, and taking a hostile approach could end in disaster. "The others?" Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What others?" The creature's tendrils rippled as it shifted, its body expanding and contracting in unnatural ways. "The ones who sought to take. They came in numbers, took what was not theirs, and left destruction in their wake." Sophie felt a chill run through her spine. It was clear now, the creature was referring to an invader, perhaps a race that had come before them, perhaps even a human faction. "Were they humans?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. The creature didn't respond immediately. Instead, it seemed to drift closer, its form folding and warping as it moved. The air itself seemed to shiver, as if the very molecules were reacting to its presence. Sophie's heart raced, and for a fleeting moment, she considered pulling away, but she held her ground. She had to know. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the creature spoke again, its voice low and rasping. "They were not like you. You are different. You do not seek to destroy. You seek something else." Sophie's mind was spinning, trying to process the information. She glanced at Jace, who was staring at the creature with suspicion. "What is it that you want from us?" she asked carefully. "We don't want trouble. We just need help." The creature's tendrils rippled once more, and it seemed to regard them with a strange mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Then, as if it had come to some decision, it extended one of its limbs toward the floor, where it began to trace symbols, arcane, glowing markings that appeared to be embedded in the stone beneath them. "You will help us," it said. "You will help us stop them." Before Sophie could respond, the ground trembled again, this time with an unsettling force. The walls of the chamber groaned, and the air became charged with an oppressive energy. The creature's tendrils jerked back, and it hissed as if in pain. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The creature's sudden reaction seemed to signal a change, a shift in the balance of power within the structure. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the growing hum that resonated through the walls. "The others," the creature rasped, its voice strained. "They are coming. They have followed. They know you are here." A roar erupted from deep within the shadows of the chamber, followed by the sound of rapid movement, something large, something angry, and far more menacing than the creature before them. "They found us," the creature hissed, its glowing eyes flickering in distress. "We cannot fight them alone. You must help us." The ground trembled harder now, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from deeper within the chamber. The creature's form began to ripple, its tendrils swirling in frantic circles as it moved to stand in front of the crew. Sophie's mind raced. There was no time for hesitation. "Everyone, get ready," she shouted. "We need to protect the ship, and we need answers. Stay close." Jace and Maya quickly moved to take defensive positions, weapons at the ready. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about survival anymore. They weren't just stranded. They had stumbled into something far larger than they could have imagined. And the stakes had just become a lot higher. The chamber had erupted into chaos. The creature, once a whisper in the darkness, had now become a desperate protector, its tendrils flailing in an attempt to shield the crew from the impending danger. Sophie's heart raced as the walls reverberated with the sounds of massive footsteps drawing closer. "Stay focused," Sophie shouted, her voice cutting through the panic. She looked at Jace and Maya, who were already crouched in defensive stances, weapons raised, their faces grim but determined. They were ready, but the reality of the situation, of standing in the midst of an unknown alien conflict, had settled in, and it was clear that no one could predict what was about to happen. The ground trembled again, a low, rumbling growl emanating from the depths of the chamber. From the shadows emerged figures, large, hulking shapes, their outlines vague in the dim light, but their presence unmistakable. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the creatures came into view. They were nothing like the first being, nothing like anything they'd ever encountered. Massive, armored creatures, covered in jagged, black exoskeletons. Their movements were swift, and the air around them seemed to warp, crackling with the energy of their power. These weren't just mindless monsters. These were warriors, and they were prepared for a fight. Sophie's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at her waist, but she knew, that guns wouldn't be enough against whatever this was. Her eyes flicked to the creature that had tried to help them, still swaying nervously in the center of the room. "They're coming for us," the creature hissed, its voice sharp with panic. "I cannot stop them. You must help me." Sophie clenched her jaw, thinking fast. She glanced back at her team. Jace and Maya were exchanging tense glances, weighing their options. They could run, there was still a chance they could make it back to the wreckage and try to fix the ship. But the feeling that something deeper was at play was suffocating. There was more to this than just survival. They had stumbled into something far bigger, and Sophie wasn't about to run without understanding what it was. She took a deep breath. "We fight," she said, her voice firm. "We'll hold them off as long as we can. And we'll find out what's really going on here." There was no time to argue. The enemy was already charging toward them, closing the gap faster than Sophie thought possible. "On my mark," Sophie barked, raising her weapon and taking aim. Her heart was hammering in her chest, but her training kicked in. The moment they moved into position, she shouted, "Now!" The sound of blaster fire filled the air as Sophie and the crew opened fire. The hulking creatures advanced without hesitation, their armored bodies shrugging off the blasts with unsettling ease. The weapons they'd brought, standard-issue energy rifles, seemed to barely make a dent in the oncoming assault. "These things are built like tanks," Jace yelled, his voice laced with frustration. He fired again, but the creatures continued their relentless advance, their eyes glowing with an unearthly intensity. Sophie gritted her teeth. We need to do more than shoot them. They're too strong. Maya, always the quick thinker, ducked behind a nearby pillar, motioning to the rest of the crew. There's a control room. I saw it when we first entered. If we can reach it, we might be able to turn the tide. Sophie looked at her, then at the advancing creatures. There was no choice. Let's move, then. Cover each other. In perfect sync, the crew fell into formation, moving with practiced precision. They dashed from cover to cover, narrowly avoiding the fire of the enemy as they made their way toward the distant control room. Sophie's mind raced as she considered the possibilities. Whoever, or whatever, these creatures were, they had power. They had technology. If they could get control of whatever systems were at play, maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide. The creatures kept coming, their movements purposeful and swift. They were relentless, and the Maverick crew was tiring quickly. Sophie's lungs burned, but she didn't stop, not even for a second. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Finally, they reached the control room. The massive door slid open with a heavy metallic hiss, revealing a chamber filled with advanced technology, screens, consoles, and blinking lights that hummed with energy. It was clear this was the heart of the structure, the place where the power came from. Sophie rushed to the main console, her fingers flying over the unfamiliar interface, but the display was in a language none of them recognized. Desperation flared in her chest. This was their only shot. Help me, Maya, Sophie called, her voice tight with urgency. Maya moved quickly to her side, scanning the controls. We don't have time to figure this out, Maya said, her voice low and tense. But there's one thing we can try. The system's mainframe is connected to a neural network. I think we can override it, or at least disrupt it long enough for us to take control of the structure's defenses. Sophie's mind raced. She nodded sharply. Do it. Whatever it takes. Maya worked fast, plugging into the console, her face pale with concentration. Sophie could hear the creatures approaching, their heavy footsteps growing louder, closer. The doors to the control room began to tremble as the massive invaders reached it, but Maya was already inputting commands, her hands a blur of motion. A low, resonant hum filled the room, and Sophie's heart skipped a beat as the structure seemed to respond to Maya's actions. Then, with a deafening crack, the ground beneath them began to shake, and the walls of the room flickered with strange energy. The air around them shimmered as if reality itself was bending. Now! Maya shouted. Sophie reached out, slamming her palm onto a large activation button just as the door to the control room burst open, and the creatures flooded in. For a split second, the entire chamber was bathed in a brilliant, white light. Then, everything went dark. Sophie opened her eyes to find herself kneeling on the floor, the weight of exhaustion bearing down on her. The air was heavy with silence. Her body ached from the adrenaline, and her head was spinning, but the first thing she noticed was the absence of the creatures. The structure had gone completely still, its power source humming quietly in the background. Sophie's heart raced as she stood up, her eyes scanning the room. Jace and Maya were already on their feet, looking just as confused and exhausted as she felt. What the hell just happened? Jace asked, his voice low. I think we did it, Maya said, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. We shut down the system. The structure's defenses, they activated. Sophie took a deep breath, her chest swelling with the rush of victory. We survived. But more importantly, we stopped them. Whatever they were, we stopped them from taking over. The creature that had helped them appeared in the doorway of the control room. It was no longer thrashing or panicked. Its glowing eyes were steady now, filled with a strange gratitude. You have done it, it said softly. You have saved us. And for that, we are in your debt. Sophie nodded, her mind still processing what had just transpired. We didn't do this for you. We did this for us, but I'm glad we could help. The creature inclined its head. We will honor our debt. You are not like the others. You will find the answers you seek. Sophie exchanged a glance with Jace and Maya. They had no idea what would come next, but for the first time since crashing on this hostile world, they felt like they had the upper hand. They had faced the unknown, fought back against the impossible, and come out on top. And as the creature led them back to the surface, where the Maverick still lay in ruins, Sophie realized that they had not just survived this planet, they had conquered it. They had done it, and they would live to tell the tale.